The clipboard hit the desk with enough force to make the coffee cup jump. "Ma'am, I need you to understand that we can't act on every conspiracy theory that walks through our doors," the young MP said, his voice carrying the particular brand of condescension reserved for crazy civilians. Behind him, his partner rolled his eyes and muttered something about another head case from the VA. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was sitting across from them was someone whose paranoid delusions had once prevented an embassy bombing that would have killed 300 people. Want to know what happened when her so-called mental breakdown uncovered the biggest domestic terror plot in base history? Hit that subscribe button and tell us where you're watching from, because this story will change how you think about the warriors we've forgotten. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Bragg's main administrative complex, turning the asphalt into a shimmering mirage of heat waves. The air conditioning struggled against the North Carolina humidity, leaving the military police station with that particular mixture of sweat, disinfectant, and institutional coffee that defined military facilities worldwide. Through the reinforced windows, the rhythmic cadence of drill sergeants echoed across the parade grounds, punctuated by the distant thrum of helicopters conducting training exercises. Sarah Martinez sat in the hard plastic chair, her weathered hands folded carefully in her lap. At 46, she bore the particular wear that came not from age, but from experience, the kind that left invisible scars deeper than any physical wound. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes that spoke of function over fashion. Worn jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and steel-toed boots that had seen better days. But there was something in the way she held herself, a subtle straightness to her spine, an awareness of her surroundings that suggested this wasn't just another troubled veteran seeking help. Her dark eyes moved constantly, but subtly, cataloging exits, noting the positions of personnel, observing patterns that others missed entirely. The slight twitch in her left eye, a souvenir from an IED blast in Kandahar, was the only outward sign of the hypervigilance that had kept her alive through 4 combat deployments. On her left wrist, barely visible beneath her sleeve, the edge of a tattoo peeked out geometric patterns that would mean nothing to most observers, but everything to those who knew what to look for. The MP station hummed with the quiet efficiency of military bureaucracy. Young soldiers processed reports, answered phones, and maintained the order that kept a base of 50,000 personnel functioning. Most were barely out of basic training, their uniforms still crisp, their confidence built on classroom knowledge rather than hard-earned experience. They moved with the particular swagger of those who had never had their assumptions about the world shattered by enemy fire. "Look, lady," said Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, 23 years old and 6 months out of MP school. His name tape gleamed with newness, and his posture suggested he'd rather be anywhere else than dealing with another psychiatric case from the VA hospital. His partner, Specialist Amy Chen, was even younger, barely 21, with the kind of by-the-book mentality that comes from wanting to prove yourself in a male-dominated field. Behind them, Sergeant First Class Williams, their section leader, signed paperwork with the distracted air of someone managing too many young soldiers with too little real-world experience. Sarah had been trying to explain her concerns for 20 minutes now, her voice steady despite the dismissive looks and barely concealed eye rolls. She identified patterns in base security that suggested coordinated surveillance, noted personnel accessing areas without proper clearance, observed supply discrepancies that indicated possible weapons diversion. But all they heard was another veteran whose mind had been broken by war, seeing threats that existed only in trauma-damaged imagination. "Ma'am, I appreciate your service, I really do," Morrison continued, his tone suggesting anything but appreciation. "But we can't investigate every hunch or feeling. You've got to understand, we get reports like this all the time from folks dealing with PTSD. It's not your fault, it's just how the mind processes trauma sometimes. Chen nodded along, her expression mixing pity with impatience. The VA has excellent mental health resources. Maybe you should focus on getting the help you need instead of… Instead of what? Sarah asked quietly, her voice carrying an undertone that might have warned someone with more experience to tread carefully. Instead of seeing threats everywhere, Williams called out from his desk, not bothering to look up from his paperwork. Look, I've been doing this job for 8 years. I've seen plenty of combat vets who can't adjust to civilian life, who think every suspicious character is a terrorist. It's textbook hypervigilance. Morrison leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. The fact is, ma'am, your medical records show multiple PTSD episodes, including one where you barricaded yourself in your apartment, thinking the neighbors were enemy combatants. Now you're here telling us that you've uncovered some grand conspiracy on one of the most secure military installations in the country. I mean, come on. Sarah's left hand moved almost imperceptibly to her right forearm, where beneath the fabric of her shirt, ink told a story these young soldiers couldn't begin to comprehend. The geometric patterns weren't random designs, but coordinates and unit designations that existed in no official records. Markers of service so classified that even her own mother had never learned what her daughter really did during those deployments to places that didn't officially exist. Have you verified the personnel rotations I mentioned? She asked, maintaining her calm demeanor despite the growing frustration evident in the set of her jaw. Chen sighed audibly. Ma'am, we don't chase ghost stories based on the gut feelings of civilians who… The door to the MP station opened with a sharp pneumatic hiss, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Colonel Marcus Washington stepped through, his presence immediately commanding attention from every soldier in the space. 28 years of service had given him the particular bearing of someone who had earned respect rather than demanded it, and his weathered face bore the quiet confidence of a leader who had brought his people home from impossible situations. Washington's eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of a career officer. His gaze lingered on Sarah for just a moment longer than necessary, noting details the younger soldiers had missed entirely: the way she positioned herself with clear lines of sight to all entrances, the subtle tension in her shoulders that spoke of someone perpetually ready for action, the unmistakable bearing of a warrior despite her civilian clothes. What seems to be the problem here? He asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made subordinates stand straighter without conscious thought. Williams immediately rose from his desk, snapping to attention. Sir, we're dealing with a routine matter. Civilian report of suspicious activity. But the individual has documented psychological issues that… I'll determine what's routine, Sergeant, Washington interrupted, his tone remaining level but with an edge that suggested Williams was walking on thin ice. And I'll decide what constitutes a credible threat assessment. He turned to Sarah, his expression neutral but respectful. Ma'am, I'm Colonel Washington, Base Security Commander. Would you mind explaining your concerns? For the first time since entering the station, Sarah felt like someone was actually listening. She straightened slightly, and something in her posture shifted not dramatically, but enough that Washington's trained eye caught the change. Sir, I've observed patterns suggesting coordinated surveillance of critical infrastructure points. Personnel accessing restricted areas without proper authorization, supply discrepancies indicating possible weapons diversion, and communication patterns consistent with cell-based operational planning. Morrison started to interrupt. Sir, she's… Washington's look could have frozen water. Did I ask for your assessment, Staff Sergeant? No, sir. Then keep your mouth shut and listen. You might learn something. He turned back to Sarah. Continue, ma'am. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket, causing Morrison and Chen to tense instinctively. But what she withdrew was a small notebook, worn and practical, filled with her careful observations. Over the past 3 weeks, I've documented 17 instances of personnel entering Facility 7 outside normal duty hours. The same individuals have been observed conducting what appears to be surveillance of the ammunition depot, the communications center, and the main gate security protocols. Washington accepted the notebook, his expression growing more serious as he scanned her meticulous notes. The handwriting was precise, the observations detailed and professionally formatted. This wasn't the rambling conspiracy theory of a disturbed mind. This was the work of someone with training in intelligence gathering and threat assessment. "These individuals," he said, studying her sketches and descriptions. "You've identified them by unit and rank?" "Yes, sir." Cross, referenced with duty rosters and access logs. The patterns suggest a coordinated effort to gather intelligence on base security vulnerabilities. Williams stepped forward, his skepticism evident. "Sir, with respect, this woman has documented mental health issues related to combat trauma. Her discharge paperwork specifically mentions episodes of paranoid ideation and—" Sarah's right hand moved to her left forearm, slowly rolling up her sleeve. The tattoo that emerged made Washington's breath catch in his throat. Geometric patterns formed coordinates 32 degrees 18 N, 64 degrees 47 E. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. But it was the small symbol at the center that made his blood run cold, a stylized dagger surrounded by wings, with numbers beneath it that existed in no official database. "Jesus Christ," Washington whispered, recognizing the mark of Task Force 88, one of the military's most classified special operations units. The numbers beneath the dagger indicated not just membership, but successful completion of operations so sensitive they were known only to a handful of Pentagon officials and intelligence chiefs. Sarah continued rolling up her sleeve, revealing more ink that told a story of service in places that didn't exist on any map. Each symbol was a mission, each coordinating a victory against enemies who had threatened American lives. The young MPs stared in growing confusion, but Washington understood exactly what he was looking at: the professional record of someone who had operated in the darkest corners of the war on terror. "Ma'am," Washington said, his voice carrying new respect and something approaching awe, "would you mind if I made a phone call?" Sarah nodded, noting how the entire dynamic in the room had shifted. Morrison and Chen exchanged uncertain glances, sensing that something significant had occurred, but lacking the knowledge to understand what. Williams looked between Sarah and the colonel, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized he had missed something crucial. Washington stepped into his office, closing the door behind him. Through the glass partition, they could see him on the phone, his expression growing increasingly grave as he spoke. After 10 minutes, he returned, his face pale but determined. "Gentlemen, lady," he said, addressing the younger soldiers with the tone reserved for career-defining moments. "You are looking at someone who doesn't officially exist in any military database, whose service record is classified at levels that require congressional notification to access. The woman you've been dismissing as mentally unstable has prevented more terrorist attacks than most of you will ever know existed." The silence in the room was deafening. Morrison's face had gone white, while Chen stared at Sarah with newfound understanding and growing horror at their earlier treatment of her. William seemed to age 10 years in 10 seconds as the implications of their behavior sank in. "The tattoos you're seeing," Washington continued, "represent successful completion of operations that prevented the deaths of thousands of American soldiers and civilians. That coordinate on her arm? That's where she spent 14 months infiltrating a network that was planning simultaneous attacks on 3 U.S. embassies. The operation she led resulted in the capture of 17 high-value targets and the prevention of what intelligence estimates would have been the largest terrorist attack since 9/11. Sarah remained silent, her expression unchanged. She had learned long ago that her service spoke for itself when it needed to. The recognition wasn't what mattered. What mattered was whether they would finally listen to her warnings about the base. Washington pulled out his phone again, this time calling base security. "This is Colonel Washington. I need an immediate lockdown of Facility 7. All personnel currently inside to be detained for questioning. Also, I want security details at the ammunition depot and communications center within 15 minutes. He paused, listening. No, this is not a drill. We have credible intelligence, suggesting a coordinated security breach. As security personnel began mobilizing across the base, Washington turned to Sarah. Ma'am, I need you to walk me through everything you've observed, every detail, no matter how small. For the next 2 hours, Sarah demonstrated the skills that had made her invaluable to Task Force 88. She recreated the patterns of movement she had observed, identified potential security vulnerabilities, and provided threat assessments with the precision of someone who had spent years tracking enemies through hostile territory. Her analysis was thorough, professional, and devastatingly accurate. The supply discrepancies you noted, Washington said, studying her documentation, correspond to weapons that could be used for an assault on the main gate. The personnel accessing Facility 7, if they're gathering intelligence on our communication protocols, they could coordinate an attack with outside elements. Sarah nodded. The timing suggests they're planning something significant, possibly coordinated with the upcoming joint training exercise when security attention will be focused on the field training areas rather than base infrastructure. As if summoned by her words, Washington's radio crackled to life. Base security to Colonel Washington. We've detained 7 individuals attempting to access classified materials in Facility 7. 2 of them were carrying weapons not authorized by their duty assignments. We've also discovered a cache of explosives hidden in the abandoned Section 8 barracks. The room erupted in controlled chaos as the reality of Sarah's warnings became undeniable. Morrison looked sick, Chen appeared ready to cry, and Williams stood frozen as the implications of how badly they had misjudged the situation sank in. "Ma'am," Washington said, turning to Sarah with the respect due a fellow warrior, "it appears your paranoid delusions have just prevented what could have been the worst terrorist attack on American soil since 9/11. How did you know?" Sarah's answer was simple, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to trust her instincts in places where failure meant death. "Because I've seen this pattern before. In Mosul, in Kandahar, in places I can't name. Terrorists don't change their operational signatures. They just adapt them to new environments. These men were preparing for a coordinated assault designed to maximize casualties and create maximum psychological impact. Over the following hours, as base security unraveled the plot, the full scope of what Sarah had prevented became clear. The terrorist cell had planned to simultaneously attack the base's communications center, detonate explosives at the main gate during a shift change when hundreds of personnel would be in the area, and assault the ammunition depot to create secondary explosions that would have killed thousands. The young MPs who had dismissed her as mentally unstable watched in stunned silence as their assumptions about combat veterans, about PTSD, about the nature of service and sacrifice, crumbled around them. Morrison would later request a transfer to a forward deployment, seeking to understand firsthand what created warriors like Sarah Martinez. Chen would dedicate her career to veteran affairs, working to ensure that no hero's warnings were ever again dismissed due to the invisible wounds of war. Williams faced disciplinary action for his failure to properly assess a credible threat, but more importantly, he would spend the rest of his career teaching young soldiers about the danger of assumptions and the importance of listening to experience, regardless of its packaging. As dawn broke over Fort Bragg, Sarah Martinez walked quietly across the parade ground toward the main gate. Her mission was complete, not the mission that had brought her to the base originally, but the one that mattered most. Behind her, the base was secure, the threat neutralized, and thousands of American lives saved by someone the system had labeled as broken. She paused at the memorial wall near the entrance, reading the names of soldiers who had given their lives in service to their country. Many of them had been her friends, her brothers and sisters in arms, who had paid the ultimate price in places whose names would never be spoken in history books. Her hand moved unconsciously to her arm, where beneath the fabric, ink recorded victories that would never be celebrated and sacrifices that would never be acknowledged. Colonel Washington caught up with her at the gate. "Ma'am," he said, slightly out of breath from hurrying across the base, "I wanted to thank you personally. If you hadn't been so persistent, if you hadn't pushed through our failure to listen." Sarah turned to face him, and for the first time since entering the MP station, she smiled not with bitterness or irony, but with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. "Colonel, I didn't serve my country for 20 years to stop serving when I took off the uniform. The mission continues, even when people think you're too broken to be useful." As she walked through the gate and into the civilian world, Sarah Martinez carried with her the knowledge that she had once again stood between evil and innocence, between chaos and order, between death and life. The young soldiers who had mocked her would remember this day for the rest of their careers, learning that strength comes in many forms, and that the most dangerous assumption is that you can judge a warrior by their wounds. The real heroes, Sarah knew, were often the ones society overlooked, the quiet professionals who carried their battles inside, who found ways to serve even when the system they had served had labeled them as damaged goods. They were the veterans who turned their hypervigilance into community watch programs, their tactical knowledge into emergency response training, their hard-won wisdom into protection for those who had never known war. In a world quick to judge and slow to understand, Sarah Martinez had proven once again that the most valuable warriors are often the ones who blend into the background, watching, waiting, ready to step forward when duty calls. Her paranoid delusions had saved thousands of lives. Her mental instability had prevented a national tragedy, and her broken mind had outthought terrorists who had spent years planning their attack. Have you ever seen someone completely underestimated because of their struggles, only to watch them prove everyone wrong when it mattered most? Share your thoughts in the comments below about the veterans in your life who carry invisible battles while still serving their communities. Hit that subscribe button to hear more stories about the quiet heroes among us. And tell us where you're watching from, because every community has veterans like Sarah Martinez waiting for someone to listen, ready to serve again when their country needs them most. These are the warriors we must never forget, the protectors we must never dismiss, and the heroes we must always honor, regardless of the scars they carry from keeping us safe.